The following podcast is part of the Underdog Sports Podcasting Network. For a full list of our shows, as well as breaking sports news and engaging feature stories, visit us at www.theunderdogsports.com.
Hey everybody, Chris Horwedel here. In this week's episode of Tales from the Association, I had the chance to talk with Paul Shirley. I can honestly tell you that when I came up with this idea, Paul was on a very short list of the people who I wanted to talk to the most, and he did not disappoint. Shirley is absolutely everything that you want Paul Shirley to be right here. Clearly an intelligent guy, Paul gives well thought out answers while sprinkling in a mix of that dry wit and humor. His new book, Stories I Tell on Dates, is available on Amazon today, and having read it myself, I can't encourage you guys to order a copy enough right now. Here is this week's Tales from the Association, featuring Paul Shirley. Enjoy.
Tales from the Association, yeah, it's going down. This the podcast, yeah, you heard it all around. Players hit us with that career, cause you know that basketball, man, is not always there. Sometimes it come and go from the recruitment to the college phase, back to the NBA draft, yeah, that's nowadays. Playing internationally, and at the life at a basketball, man, they gonna tell us all how it go. See, story is how now you know. Tales from the Association, yeah.
Welcome to Tales from the Association. I'm Chris Horwedel. My guest today is former Iowa State big man turned, in his words, basketball vagabond turned author. His new book, Stories I Tell on Dates, coincidentally is available today. Of course, I can only be talking about the multi-talented nomad that is Paul Shirley. Paul, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's not a coincidence. You've been planning this for years. Like, let's wait till Paul has a book coming out, and then we'll record a podcast that goes out that day.
Well, sure. We'll let everybody behind the scenes here. You've been begging to be on this show for years, which, I mean, it's only existed for 6 months.
Years.
It's just strange, but finally you got
I was in the back of your head, just saying, like, please start a podcast so I can be on.
That's going to bother me for maybe the rest of my life. That voice in my head is Paul Shirley.
It's not a bad voice.
No, I'm not saying that at all. So yes, you finally got around to writing the book, the second, which, I wouldn't let you be on for the first. We wanted to see how that went, but the second is out and you're here, and thanks for that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, the second one is actually in some ways the third one, because I threw one in the trash in between. My first book did come out in 2007, which seems so long ago.
It does.
And so to me, it feels a little bit lazy that it's only second book now, but I often forget that I went back to like finishing a basketball career and then also like starting another whole career in the interim. So sure. I have to be a little kinder to myself, practice a little loving kindness, as Tara Brock would say.
Oh, there you go. So you were actually kind enough to send me a copy of the book. I enjoyed it, and as I told you just moments ago, I picked up a copy of your first book on Amazon, and I could not encourage everyone else to do so more than I do. Read the book. If you like basketball, you're going to like both of these.
Thanks, man. Yeah. I mean, I think the first one is very basketball, although my pitch is always to people who are not basketball people that really it's about anybody who's getting out of college, entering a weird career, and doesn't know what to make of it. And then the second one, there is a fair bit of basketball in there, but that's definitely not where we're hanging our hat. I think the basketball stories exist because that's such a big part of my life. But most of it is the fact that one tells certain stories about themselves as a way to frame who they are for the person sitting across from them on a date or sitting next to them on an airplane or whatever it is. I'm kind of fascinated with how we talk about ourselves. I think people tend to think that dates or any situation is a bunch of question and answer, but in reality, the way we get to know each other is through the stories we tell. I mean, when we were talking before we even recording, we were telling stories about, oh, this is what's going on with my stupid landlord, and you were saying this is what's going on with where I'm living, and we didn't, I didn't say like, hey, man, what's your current housing situation? There are things that come up, and those have a lot to do with like the mood you're in, and you can tell a lot about another person by the way they tell stories about themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's talk about your basketball journey, and then we'll talk about the books and everything else that's going on in your life a little bit more. So you came out of Jefferson West, and good career there. This is a weird question for me now, given everything that's going on, but what was the recruiting process like for you?
I'm very tepid recruiting experience in that it has been a long time, and then it's been 20 years since I graduated from high school or whatever that number is. But in other ways, it hasn't been that long, and so therefore it's amazing how much things have changed since then. So in 1995, which would have been like my junior year of high school, there wasn't social media, there wasn't text messages, so you could still kind of like hide out if you were a pretty good basketball player. And I did a lot of that hiding out in the small town courts of Kansas. And so it was assumed that I was just like, oh, he's good, but he plays at a small high school, and he's probably too white and too skinny to play anywhere big. So most of my offers were Division IIs. I had a lot of Ivy League interest, and then went to a visit at the University of North Dakota, of all places, but told them no, and then the assistant at North Dakota told Tim Floyd, who was at Iowa State, that he thought that there was this kid in Kansas who was good enough to play in the Big 12, and nobody knew about him. So we got in touch. Then Tim Floyd had to say, like, nah, sorry, all our scholarships are gone. My mother then, wisely, though, did a little research, and I was not a humble brag, just a brag. I was a National Merit Scholar.
All right.
She figured out that at Iowa State, you could go to school there for free if you were a National Merit finalist. So we Floyd back and we're like, hey, so if Paul could come there for free, would you like to have him on the team? He's like, yeah. It's a no situation for me. I get somebody to boost the academic standings, and I don't have to pay a scholarship. So I went to Iowa State as a walk-on. We didn't tell anybody. It was my big deal with Coach Floyd, because I think rightfully knew that, like, I would be perceived a different way if people knew I was a walk-on. So
right.
He was so great in treating me just like everyone else. And I think that meant that my teammates didn't have any reason to think less of my abilities. Because you know how it is. A lot of this stuff is perception.
Absolutely.
There's a reason that, like, I don't know what the percentages are, but the percentages of McDonald's All-Americans who go on to get drafted is really high, because there is this sense of, like, well, McDonald's All-American, they must still be pretty good. And I think, for better or for worse, it's hard to change that narrative when you're in the middle of it. So we were really adamant that I not be treated as a walk-on, although it's fun to talk about now. Like, it's one of those things where I take a little pride in the fact that I was a walk-on at a Division I school, and I managed to work my way into being a starter, and we had some really good teams there. At the time, it seemed very important, and I think it probably was, to hide that from people.
Well, it's almost more impressive in a way, because not only were you good enough athletically, but you were also good enough academically.
Yeah, I'm a maniac, man. It's like, I was just doing someone's podcast, and they were saying, like, so do you have the, like, stereotypical father who drove you into sports? And I was like, well, I have the stereotypical father and mother who drove me to do everything the best that you could.
Right.
So, and I think it gets lost sometimes when we talk about athletes, because, you know, maybe a guy's not all that well spoken, or maybe it doesn't seem like he's that connected to being a worker. But most of the guys who really make it to the highest levels are like Marines. I mean, they're so dedicated to their craft that it does feel like you're dealing with, like, kind of a savant. I think what's interesting is that at the lower levels, there are a lot of guys who aren't that way, who are just talented enough that they can get by. But then when you get to the NBA or you get to the top levels in Europe, that weeds them out. And there just aren't very many guys who really get away with being assholes, or who get away with being lazy, or who don't show up on time to things. Most of the best are pretty good about that.
Right. And you kind of have to be the best of the best if you want to get away with that at that level.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I think that there are a few guys who can get away with being kind of shitty. Like, I love I loved some of those dudes that didn't toe the company line, because as I got older, I got more and more rebellious. But I loved playing with Ricky Davis, for example, because he didn't really care. But he was like good enough that he could kind of get away with it. It's just that you can't do it for very long, and you'll probably never become Paul Pierce if you are of that attitude.
Yeah, Ricky Davis did not become Paul Pierce. That's definitely safe to say.
No, but I would rather hang out with Ricky Davis for sure than with Paul Pierce. Nothing against Paul Pierce. I don't know. It's just that like it's usually the case too that those guys are like not that interesting to talk to. I mean, in reality, I don't think it gets talked about, but I think a lot of really great athletes are either psychopaths or they have Asperger's. I don't say that facetiously. I really think that like to be that nuts about it, you got to have a little screw loose.
Fair enough. That's an interesting way to think about it, that there needs to be some sort of psychological like switch flipped if you actually want to be that good.
Yeah, I mean, I remember people always ask, like, because I played on that great Phoenix Suns team of 2004 and 5 with Steve Nash and Amari Stoudemire and all that, and so people want to hear, oh, so was it just you guys out at like bars and clubs? No, it was not that at all, because everyone is his own little corporation, and because everyone was so separate from one another. Joe Johnson had like basically a little tiny cadre of people who just sort of surrounded him at all times. And I thought at the time, like, oh, does that mean he just doesn't talk to us? I really think that he probably had some pretty heavy duty social anxiety, and like these guys were just easy to be around, and so he didn't really need to talk to anybody else. I mean, I don't think Joe Johnson said 8 words that I was around him that year. And I think that if he were a concert pianist, we'd be like, oh, that's pretty normal.
Right.
But we tend to think athletes should be these like gregarious, magnanimous people who can like really like hold them. And there are some of those guys, but I would say that most of the guys I was around are the opposite of that.
That's interesting. And that's the first I'm hearing that, and it totally makes sense too. It absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, well, there's actually a little bit of a racial component as well, in that, like, if you thought of like a quiet kind of maybe autistic kid, you'd be like, oh, it's a white kid with glasses who like sits in the corner. Right. You don't think of like a 6'9", 240-pound black dude who plays in the NBA, because we don't cross reference that very well. We don't like see that. But I would say that a lot of the dudes I was around were, and this is not meant at all in a derogatory way. They're probably slightly on the spectrum. They're just like not great with people, but they're great with this activity of putting the ball in the hoop. That's not at all everyone. Like Kevin Garnett is such a good guy and such an interesting dude. Steve Nash, same thing. But I could give you a lot of examples off the air of dudes who weren't.
So what I'm taking from this, Joe Johnson, autistic.
Possibly.
that's what I heard.
Again, I think it should be always framed in the way that we talk about, like with parenting or something. Like there's nothing wrong with being autistic.
Oh, of course.
In fact, that's where a lot of genius comes from. I just don't want it to go into the cybersphere. Like Paul Shirley says, Joe Johnson's autistic.
No, that is not what we are saying here.
But I said it, so now it's going to be in the cybersphere. Shit.
But it's a very fine. Look, I was a psych major in college, and it is a very fine line between genius and insanity. And I think you're absolutely seeing that.
Yeah, the dedication, and I think like I probably had a little of that myself. I think I was changed significantly when I got. You maybe made it to this part of the book, or you maybe know this about me. I had this massive injury when I was briefly playing for the Chicago Bulls, where I had my kidney and spleen ruptured by Austin Crozier and almost died. And that really switched my outlook, in that I before that I didn't drink. I didn't really date very much. I was just like this kind of militaristic athlete. And once that happened, I was like, whoa, Paul, you got to like experience a little life.
Right.
So I think the only reason I can even talk about this in this way is because I've been on that, where people who went to college with me are like, how did you turn out to be interesting? Because you were lame in college.
I can't stress this enough. Let's just touch on what Paul just said when he said, if you got to this point in the book, and I mentioned it to Paul, I loved the parts I read, but I did get to a point where I realized I'm going to be talking to this guy, and I'd like to have an organic conversation with him. But I will absolutely be going back to it.
Yeah, I wonder about if I should ever get to go on a date again after writing this book. It is possible that someone could read the book and then go on a date with me, and that would be terrible because then I'd be like, well, I got nothing to say.
Right. Well,
you know everything about me.
It's crazy how much you can find out about any other human being in the age we live in anyway, and you're literally just putting all of it out there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a credit to my friend Katie Savage. Did the bulk of the editing that kind of helped me shape this at the end, and she's so good at finding the vulnerability in things. I think we all have this tendency to paint ourselves in certain ways, like we want people to see us a certain way, and she was really great about okay, you veered from the vulnerability and you're trying to impress people. That's what makes the book work, is that it is me really just telling everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, let's get back to your journey here. So you go to Iowa State, walk on, academic all-star, all of that. Freshman year, you don't play a ton. Sophomore season, definitely a step in the right direction. Junior season's a little bit of a step back. At what point, or I'm sorry, junior season's actually a big step forward. You're averaging double figures in points. And no, I was right, Paul. I was right. Junior season step back, senior season big step up, double figures in points, almost 7 rebounds a game. At what point is the NBA on your mind, if at all?
I remember so I had decided when I was very young that I was going to be a Major League Baseball player because my first love was baseball. And I was actually a really good baseball player. And then I started to grow, and I also got my nose broken by a pitch, and then I was scared of being in the batter's box, and also found that basketball served as a rebellion against my dad, who really wanted us to all be baseball players. So I think I thought at age 12 that I was going to be a professional athlete. Now, I think a lot of 12-year-olds think that.
Yes.
So it's kind of strange to talk about, because I think I had this sense that I can do that even at 15, 16, 17. And it was hard when I was not being recruited and all of those things. So I was I'm pretty sure I'm going to be really good at this eventually, especially when the hormones kick in and I get hair under my armpits and stuff. So it's strange, because I think I had that sense. I didn't tell anybody because it was crazy to talk about that. But I probably, at the deepest, darkest recesses of my brain at age 17, was I'm going to play in the NBA someday. Now, when that became realistic, I remember going to this summer camp that was run by the Portland Trailblazers in concert with a youth camp that happened it was called Snow Valley, I think.
Okay.
And there were a bunch of guys who the Trailblazers basically wanted to bring guys in to look at them, but they had to figure out how to do it legally. So they flew them in to be camp counselors, and then we would play at night. And so I remember that Brian Scalabrine was there, and Melvin Eli was there, and some other guys who were Joseph Forte. I don't remember exactly the names of the people. And so it was oh shit, I'm probably as good as these dudes. This might work out. And so then my junior and senior year, we were really good at Iowa State. We won Big 12 championships both years, and I was lucky enough to get to play with Marcus Fizer and Jamal Tinsley. Lucky in the sense that they were really good, and that made my job a lot easier, and that I could just sort of ride their tails. And so I think I lucked out. If I had played at Texas A&M at the time or something, and we'd been an also-ran, I don't know that I would have gotten the attention, but I was big enough and athletic enough where I could warrant a summer camp invite, and then actually he's pretty good. Let's just invite him to training camp. Maybe this is going to work out. So it was a very slow burn when it comes to this is realistic, but it had kind of been in the back of my mind for a really long time.
Now, you see like this interesting phenomenon with people who are taller, especially very tall, wherein some of them genuinely love basketball and other people see it as a means to an end. Which one of them was it for you?
It was love for sure.
Good.
Like I don't care about basketball at all now. Like I haven't watched a game in 2 years. I haven't played basketball in 3 years. So that love is completely over. So it's sometimes difficult for me to even remember what that was like. But I loved being on the court and feeling like I was present in my body. I loved the fact that each day I knew that I could go in the gym not knowing how to do a thing and then leave later that day knowing how to do that thing. I also loved being able to transition from sort of mild-mannered, nice guy off to a goddamn maniac on the court. Like you get to engage your most base self, and that was truly addictive. What I think you're right, that some people who played basketball or who played sports in general saw it as like, this is what I do because I'm big and tall, whatever. And so it's hard for me to remember that that's the case for some people. And for those people, a lot of times what they loved was the crowds and the pageantry. And I liked that, of course. I mean, that stuff's fun. But I think what really mattered to me was this sense of I'm able to do this thing that most people cannot. And it is almost like dance or being in a play or something like that, where like I just love feeling this sense of I have this capacity and now I can show it off to the world. And it didn't matter. Like I probably enjoyed the summers when I could just go and work out and kind of be on the court by myself more than the actual games, because that introduced like guys whose motives weren't necessarily lined up with mine. And I think I always suffered because I had really kind of had my heart broken a bunch of times, because I always thought if I get to the highest level, it's just going to be guys like me. And all we're going to care about is winning and playing the right way. And occasionally you would come across that, but most of the time there was just this shittiness of, oh, well, that guy just cares about his contract for next year. And I think that's so hard if you are one of those people who truly loves what you're doing. It only takes one person or two people to kind of screw that all up.
Yeah, it's sad, but I think it's true that you find that in any field in life, regardless of how noble it may seem or how hard it is to get there. There's people who were just there because it's a job.
Right, and I mean, I think we all go through that, whether it's computer programming or playing in the NBA. And I think that's what is sometimes difficult for people to reconcile with my writings, in that I will complain a lot of the time about like, oh, God damn, what am I doing with my life? And most people will say, well, dude, if I had gotten that chance, I would never complain about it. And what is difficult to talk about, I think, is the truth is, sir, you never would have had that chance. I got here in part because I had this sort of self-image that I could do it. And so it was, to me, it wasn't like I should be so thankful that I'm here. It's like, well, of course I'm here. Like I put in all this work and like time and energy. This is the logical step. Why would I not have complaints about it, just like everybody else has a complaint about their day-to-day job?
Right. Oh, that makes total sense. So you talk about these pre-draft workouts with the Trailblazers and all of that stuff. What are you doing in preparation of that draft, and what are your expectations heading in?
So I had played, after my senior year, I went off to Portsmouth, which I think still exists, but at the time was it still was held in slightly higher esteem for guys who were like going to be second-round picks or go overseas or something like that. I played well enough there that an agent was like, whoa, you're better than I thought you were, which is sort of the running byline of my career. And then went that summer to, let's see, I have to forgive me, it's so long ago.
It's fine.
I went that summer to Summer League with the Cavaliers, and there had been talk prior to that maybe they would pick me in the second round, but it wasn't very likely, and sure enough, they didn't, which was not a surprise at all. I think that year they drafted Carlos Boozer in the second round.
That works out.
It's odd. It went okay. It's funny, like, these are the I'm hesitant to talk about because it doesn't come off very well, but at the time, when I went to Summer League with Carlos Boozer and the Cavaliers, and I think DeJuan Wagner might have been on that team.
Interesting.
I'm not sure. Like, Carlos Boozer and I were like, kind of fighting it out. Like, we're pretty even for, like, oh, I'm not sure which guy's better. So there's always that sense of, oh, he probably made $150 million in his basketball career, and I made like $800,000, which will drive you crazy if you let it. I remember when I was very young, I would be watching NBA games and be like, I'm just as good as this guy. And my dad would be like, yeah, well, there's some guy who's saying that about you, and he's right. That's like playing in the second division in Kosovo. So I think the truth is that, like, there are, 50 guys who are dead sure NBA players, the best of the best. And then the next 600 are kind of interchangeable. And I was one of those interchangeable guys. Like, there's an alternate universe where I had like a 10-year NBA career, like, I don't know, Jeff Foster or something. But there's also an alternate universe where I played for 2 years in Ireland and then hung it up at. So, like, I don't have a lot of envy. It's not like I sit around thinking about one or the other, because I think I actually had a really cool career because I got to have access to, like, being in the NBA briefly, but also getting to be overseas and, like, and also riding the bus through the depths of California from to Fresno to play an ABA game. Like, that built a lot of character and made me more interesting than I would be otherwise.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a fascinating thing that you're talking about here, wherein the people are so interchangeable, and it's so much of it comes down to opportunity. You're right. Like, and also so much of it comes down to when you're playing, because look at the contracts that are getting handed out today. I talked to Travis Diener the other day, and Travis signed like a 3-year deal for like $2.6 million, something like that. If he signs that 10 years later, that's a $12 million contract. And
right.
It's opportunity is so much of depends so much on who makes it and who doesn't. You know, you're right. There's no reason you couldn't have been like, Will Perdue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as big as Will Perdue, but there's probably the better example is maybe like there's no reason I couldn't have been Zarko Chaparkova, right? So I was also fighting with like these guys. I gotcha. I would draft those guys too, but like I also had to kind of flail away with like, oh well, now everybody's getting drafted out of high school or they're getting drafted out of Slovenia. And so if I had been born 20 years earlier, I probably would have had a 10-year NBA career. But that at the time would have been the ultimate. Like, that's what I wanted, of course. But looking back, I would not trade it for anything because, like, I just don't know. I think it would be hard now for me to keep moving. You know, like I'm really hooked up to my writing career because, in part, like, I don't have a ton of money. Like, that's a great motivator for keeping going.
Absolutely. You did come along at the height of that international craze too. I remember Capono said he should have moved overseas, grown a beard, and he'd be the top 10 pick in the draft.
Yeah, a friend of mine and I had that theory of like, we should just the opposite, shave all of our facial hair, go overseas, bury ourselves for a year, and pretend we're 18 and like change our names and see if we can get drafted. I had an interesting moment with Jason Capono one time when he was playing, I think, for the Cavaliers, and I was playing for the Bulls, and we were both in at garbage time, and I had been talking to him. I knew him just from reputation. And I remember vividly that, like, we looked at each other from across the lane, and there's just this fraternity of, like, white dudes from America in the NBA, because there were, like, 4 of us. So he just, it was so subtle, but he just like, hey, what's up, Paul? And, like, that moment of, like, we both know who the other person is because, like, we know what the other person's going through. It was a very precious moment for me because I felt like I'm accepted into a very small fraternity.
Yeah, absolutely. Smaller even than the fraternity of NBA players, which is tiny, but you have this tiny little subset of white people in the NBA at that point.
Right.
I don't know. We can debate why the racial breakdown is what it is another time, but let's talk about you were undrafted. You go to play in the Greek basketball league with, I'm going to butcher this, Panionios Athens. How did that come about?
Panionios. That happened because I went to training camp with the world champion Los Angeles Lakers and got cut as soon as they could cut me. On the same day, I vividly remember with Dennis Scott, which was, I felt like, kind of fun. I was like, well, at least I made it as long as Dennis Scott, which was not very long at all, but, he's a recognizable name. So then, went off to Greece, played the rest of the year there. That was from October to May or June. And really loved my time there, except that they didn't pay me everything they owed me, which stuck in my craw.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard that from lots of guys who play overseas. I got a nice little lesson in economics probably much later than that. So I went to Greece in 2001, I believe. And after the financial crisis, the Greek creditors had their debtors take a haircut on what they were owed, and that haircut, which means that they if they owed the people who had borrowed from them $1, they gave them 50 cents, was exactly the amount that I got when I was in Greece. I was supposed to get paid $105,000, and I got $52,000 of that money. So if you're ever dealing with business, you should just expect to get half of what you're owed.
Well, you can look at it on the plus side here, wherein you got paid $52,000 to go live in Greece for a while.
Yeah, true. I mean, that is one way to look at it. It's just when you're in the middle of it, it is not as easy to look at it like that. Because I think what people can sometimes forget is that you don't have very many money-making years as a basketball player.
Right.
And again, I would say now I'm perfectly happy with the way my career went. But in the middle of it, you're like, dude, I just gave you one of my good years, and you're not paying me what you owe me? That's not great.
What was the transition like for a 23-year-old Paul Shirley to move to Greece?
It was heady. I had never been to Europe. And I show up with 2 duffel bags, and now I'm just on this team with a bunch of veterans from France and Portugal and of course Greece. And we're traveling all over Europe. We're not in the Euro League. We're in the next league down, which was called the Supporter Cup at the time. And so it was a great education because I got to see a lot of Europe, got to play a ton. I had the feeling that, if I just stay over here, I could probably make some real money. So, of course, I didn't do that.
Right. Actually, that was one of those questions I had for you a little bit later on. What's that line like, trying to debate between trying to get back to the NBA or just settling into a fairly lucrative career overseas?
I think if I had been more self-assured, I probably would have just stayed in Europe. But I think I felt like I needed the NBA badge to kind of legitimize what I was doing. And again, I don't know that I was wrong about that, because it is amazing how much being able to add that former NBA player to your resume adds to any sort of whatever, not necessarily resume, but just cachet when you're writing a book, for example. Even though I played in a total of 30 games or something in the NBA, it still counts to the outsider. Because even to me, I'm always I played in the NBA, but not very much. But to the average person, it's at least as good as Vladimir Radmanovic. It's not Kobe Bryant, but to them, it's the same.
Vlad. No, I would say you're above Vlad Rad in on the sort of pantheon of pro basketball players in people's minds.
Well, only because I've clawed my way into their minds because I wrote about it a lot. Vladimir Radmanovic was a much better basketball player than I was, but he is going to be remembered less because he didn't write a bunch of navel-gazing books about it.
Right. Good basketball player, mediocre author, Vlad Radmanovic.
As far as we know, he could be big in Serbia.
So I guess we sort of saw that eagerness to get back to the NBA in your next move when you go to the Sun Kings and the CBA. Is that a move sort of tailor-made to get you back playing in the United States and back on the NBA radar?
Yeah, I mean, it's even easy for me to look at it in a linear way, but probably a lot of it was that team in Greece had an option on my contract for the second year, and then they didn't pay me for the first year, so we were out of that option. And so I went to training camp with the Atlanta Hawks, and in Atlanta it came down to me and another guy the night before opening day, which was obviously progress on the year before. So I felt like, and my agent felt like, oh, I'm pretty close. And the Atlanta Hawks are not necessarily saying you're going to be our first call up, but they're implying that. So let's use this year to go to the CBA and see if that works out. And it did, thankfully, even though there were several rock bottom moments where I was like, I'm going to quit basketball because I don't want to be in North Dakota right now. And other people are having lives. And what am I doing with myself? Again, looking back, it makes perfect sense. Like, oh, yeah, you played the minor leagues and then you got called up. But at the time, I was like, I'm never going to get called up. I'm so far from anyone's brain, and this is a terrible idea.
Right. Well, luckily, that wasn't the case. You do get the opportunity to play with the Hawks that year. What was that experience like?
I played 5 minutes, and I got up 5 shots because I was like, I may not have to be back here. I'm going to score a basket, and I failed miserably on all accounts. I do remember that I think I played 1 minute against the Milwaukee Bucks in Milwaukee. It was like my first ever game. And Dan Dickow was on the team. He was a fellow garbage time guy with me. And I was like wide open under the basket. And I was like, dude, throw me the ball so I can score my first points. Well, he didn't know I was hoping for my first point. So he went up for a shot. And so I didn't get that. I didn't get that first score that year.
Well, Dickow's been on the show. I'll I'll send a text over.
Yeah, let him know.
You're still angry about it.
Let him know.
And
it worked out. I would be angry. Like, what if I had been like, I don't know. I was reading about there's a dude who plays for the Kansas City Royals named Whit Merrifield, and I guess his dad got called up one game, and then maybe it got rained out or something like that. So he never actually appeared in a game. And so there was a part of me that was like, what if I never go back? And that was it. That was my one chance.
I am really glad you said, not for you, but really glad you say that, because my next question is, in those 2 games, you grab 1 rebound, but you don't manage to score. So I think from what you just said, it's fair to think, holy shit, I might have just blown my chance.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because, again, you realize as that player, these margins are real thin, and nobody really cares if Paul Shirley's on their team. So I'm like, I'm not changing anybody's fortune. So it'd be really easy for me to just go down to the minors or to go overseas and never be heard from again.
And there's, talking about alternate realities, there's an alternate reality where Dickow finds you, you're open, the bucket goes, you start feeling good, and that's the start of that 11-year NBA career you wanted. Yeah,
you just never know. I mean, it is in thinking back, it is crazy to think about how much those first impressions do mean. A couple of years later, I went to training camp with the Phoenix Suns, and vividly remember I had this really amazing summer with Scott Wedman, who played for the Celtics and Kansas City Kings and became kind of my shot whisperer. And he basically fixed my jump shot, which had gotten all screwed up when I got hurt a couple of times. And I remember Steve Nash passes me the ball on a pick and pop first couple of days of training camp, and I make 20-footers, and suddenly I'm the guy who can shoot, which was true. I could shoot, but it mattered in their minds that that was the first thing I did, and so that was their first impression. And so now the rest of training camp is just so much easier because I've gotten that reputation based on first impression.
Right. So after the Hawks, you're in Spain. Are you thinking, okay, I mean, we talked about this before, but has your mindset changed at all in terms of I need to get back to the NBA versus I need to make money and have a life?
Yeah, boy, it's hard to say, not because am dodging the question, but just because I can't really remember. I remember being really dead set when I was in Spain on getting back to the U.S. so I could train for Summer League. But at the time, it was more like I need to train for Summer League so that I can either put myself in position to play for an NBA team or for a better European team. Like I was playing for Juventud, which is actually a really good Spanish basketball club that produced Ricky Rubio and Rudy Fernandez. But it was also a team that was, again, playing in like the second level of international competition. They were first division in Spain, but second division internationally. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking like, well, I want one of these, because at the time in Europe, there were some pretty big contracts getting handed out. So it was more like, I just need to go to this place where I can continue to sort of cultivate this reputation and maybe like that Spanish job, I got paid $80,000 for 4 months.
All right. Okay. So after the ABA, we're back in the NBA with the Bulls. 3 coaches that season. Who did you actually play under? Because I couldn't really find that out.
Scott Skiles.
What was that like?
Oh, I loved him, mostly because he didn't have any preconceived notions about who I was as a player. Mm-hmm. So he didn't care that Tyson Chandler and Eddie Curry were on huge contracts. He was like, if you'll play hard, then I'll play you. And so I had this sense that if I just kind of like rose above the chaos, because that was a very bad Bulls team with Jamal Crawford and Jerome Williams and Kurt Heinrich is on that team. It's not his fault that they were bad. It's more the fault of some of the other dudes. Anyway, if I could just sort of like play hard and keep my head down, that I might like find a spot. And sure enough, like I started to play a little bit and was playing like in Indianapolis, played like 27 minutes, which I think is still my career high, like 19 minutes in a row in the second half. Was just feeling like all I got to do is just like suffer through this and show them that I can like take whatever they throw at me. And then rotate over to take a charge on Austin Crozier, and he puts his knee in my side, and my kidney and spleen both rupture at that second. And I almost died on an airplane on the way back from Indianapolis to Chicago. And that threw a little wrench in the old career. Like I kind of thought, just throw your body around, do whatever you can, and you might look up and they've signed you to a year-long contract for the next season, almost as a, hey, this guy's willing to do it, like, why won't you? Which would be fine with me. I didn't care. So at the time, I was like, well, that was my chance. Like, I got hurt, and now I'm never going to get in that spot again. As it turns out, that injury actually sort of reframed how I thought, as I mentioned earlier, my life, how I thought about, like, how I played, and I was a much better basketball player after that because I wasn't quite as willing to just do whatever it took. Yeah. I changed the way I thought about things, and I for me, caring less was actually really good for my career.
Right. So after the Bulls, we have Russia, we have the Suns, we have China, we have training camp with the Timberwolves, a couple more stops in Spain. After that last year in Spain, what's going through your mind? Do you know at this point that maybe it's time to transition to the next part of your career?
I definitely had that inkling, but one of the things that's hard when people ask me, like, how long did you play or when did you stop playing, is that the transition is not as cut and dried as, like, here's my last press conference, guys, I'm done, because nobody gives a shit if journeyman Paul Shirley hangs it up. It's more that, like, as an example, I signed a contract to go to where are Romeo and Juliet from?
Oh God,
in Italy.
Yeah.
Damn it, it's escaping. Whatever that town is. Verona. Is it Verona?
That's fine.
Anyway,
I'll have
Verona.
it for a second.
Let's go with Verona. I think it's Verona. Anyway, that team offered me a deal for the year, and my then girlfriend and I were going to go to Verona and live there, and it was going to be magical and beautiful, and I already had the flight set up and everything. And then, like, 10 days before I'm supposed to leave, they're like, we just hired a new GM, and he doesn't want to take a chance because you're 32 years old. Your contract's done. And you're like, well, but I signed it. It's Italy, man. We don't care about that.
Right.
So, that year because the contract had gone away, I was like, well, I'm still playing and kind of rehabbing from, I'd had 2 ankle surgeries at that point. plus 2 knee surgeries. So I'm thinking like, well, keep training. Maybe a team will be interested. So there's just this like gradual decline of there aren't that many teams that are interested, and I'm not that interested anymore, and I'm not willing to put up with, going to X team in Y division for Z dollars. So let's move to Los Angeles and start a writing career. Not start, but continue.
Sure. All right. Well, let's play some quick name association with you. First thing that you think of when I mention some of the names of your former teammates.
Okay.
We're going to go Sharif Abdur-Rahim.
Studious.
Dan Dickau.
Great hair.
Darvin Ham.
Jovial.
Theo Ratliff.
Stern and possibly a zombie.
Big Dog, Glenn Robinson.
Laid back.
That's probably kind. Tyson Chandler.
Dickhead.
Elaborate.
Oh, I think he's weirdly like fooled people into thinking he's this elder statesman of the NBA, but God, he was awful when he was young. Like he was just like insecure and shitty.
Interesting.
When I played for the Bulls.
Fair enough. Jamal Crawford. Most
selfish basketball player I've ever played around.
No need to elaborate on that one. I think we all get that. Eddie Curry.
Misunderstood.
Kendall Gill.
Hyperbaric chamber. I think he carried around one of those hyperbaric chambers to all of the road games so he could sleep in it somehow. It was very weird.
Yeah, I've never really understood the logic of all that, but whatever. Donyell Marshall.
I don't think we actually crossed paths. We must have been on the roster at the same time, but he seems also laid back.
Okay. Scottie Pippen.
He's the guy that I had to say, Scotty, go get the trainer, when I was almost dying on the airplane. He had come back to retire as a Bull, and my one-word association would be taciturn.
Well, it was nice of Scotty to sort of save your life.
Exactly.
Jalen Rose.
Who?
Jalen Rose.
Also not on my team with me at that time. Seems like a pretty fun dude on TV, but I've never met him.
Going by Basketball Reference, I apologize. Jimmy Jackson.
We one time we were playing in Atlanta, and I remember this was again that Phoenix Suns team that's really good. And Jimmy Jackson comes in from warming up. He's like, "Guys, look out! A lot of fans dressed up like empty seats out there tonight." Which I enjoyed because Atlanta was notorious for not having anybody at the game.
Well, I think we know what we would go with for Joe Johnson, so we'll move on to Shawn Marion.
Not bright.
Steve Nash.
Career arc, because I got to see him go from fairly well-known basketball player to MVP of the league, and now, because we both live in LA, we've crossed paths a few times, and now I've gotten to see him like transition to guy out of basketball, and he's very grounded and like thoughtful about that, which has been nice.
Last guy's Amari.
He's either really complicated or really simple. I'm not sure.
Well, your book, Stories I Tell on Dates, is out today. How can people get it?
It's on a website called Amazon.com. It's at Barnes & Noble. You can go to storiesitellondates.com and find out more information. If you are anti-Amazon or anti-Barnes & Noble, we'll figure out how to get it into your hand.
And what's next for Paul Shirley?
I run a writer's workshop out here in LA called Writer's Block, and that's growing, which is cool. I'm still teaching, and then I'm working on 2 more books. One's a young adult novel about the kid who finds basketball as a way to fit into a small town, and the other is a novel for grown-ups that actually uses some of my experiences in Spain, and we'll see if ever either of them see the light of day.
Very nice. Well, that is Tales from the Association. My guest has been Paul Shirley. Paul, thanks so much for coming on the show. I genuinely enjoyed it.
I'm glad, because it would be frustrating if you're like, I only figuratively enjoyed it. I'm just saying that I enjoyed it.
Horrible experience.